My demons won. That was the last thing he said before closing his eyes forever, a sentence that echoes like a cold whisper in the mind of whoever hears it. But what exactly does it mean? What goes on in the mind of a serial killer moments before death? Will it be genuine repentance or manipulation to the end? Maybe you've never thought about it. Or maybe you've wondered how someone capable of committing such brutal acts faces his own end. Those final moments when there's no more escape, no more lies to sustain. Does he see everything he's done as a succession of bad choices, or as a sick glory of an ego that never repented? Stay with me until the end, because what you're about to discover now might surprise you. In those last words, "My demons have won," there is more than a lament. There is a dark portrait of a mind that perhaps never wanted to be saved, and it is precisely this that leads us to question, how far does a murderer's conscience go? Does he know that what he did is wrong, or does he simply not care? Let's dive into the psychology behind extreme behavior and walk through the corridors of a serial killer's mind in his final moments. We're not just talking about crimes, we're talking about silences, empty stares, a past that shaped a dysfunctional personality. How many times have you heard someone say that he looked normal? How many times has horror been disguised under the skin of someone ordinary? That is the most disturbing nature of these cases, the ability to manipulate, to lie with the eyes, to appear remorseful when, in fact, it is all part of an ultimate game. And in this game, the final words become clues, confessions, or perhaps emotional traps to make us doubt our own reason. Have you ever been there? Have you watched an interview or read a final letter and wondered, did he really feel anything? Well, that's the crux of the matter. Silence isn't always guilt, crying isn't always remorse, and not every confession is true. By saying, "My demons have won," he could be trying to move us, to manipulate us, or simply telling the purest truth of his tormented existence. But how do you know? What hides behind a seemingly calm face, minutes before being erased from history? Get ready for a disturbing journey. We will explore fragments of the human mind that few dare to enter. Understand how traumas, disorders, and choices shape profiles that defy logic. And in the next part, we will open the first window into this dark universe, where regret, guilt, and perversity mix in almost indistinguishable doses. And in the next part, we will open the first window into this dark universe, where regret, guilt, and perversity mix in almost indistinguishable doses. But before we go any further, let me ask you something. What you felt so far? Because when we talk about such complex and disturbing minds, something inevitably stirs inside us. It could be fear, curiosity, indignation, or even that strange feeling of seeing for a second a human trait in someone who should no longer be called that. And that's where the conversation really begins, not just between us, but between everyone who is here watching and allowing themselves to delve into this topic. If this topic resonates with you, if it touched you or provoked you in some way, leave a comment below with what caught your attention. Sometimes a simple sentence can open up a new perspective for the reader, and together we can create a safe space to reflect on things that many people avoid even thinking about. And look, if you've made it this far, it's because there's something deep inside you that you want to understand more about, right? So, like this video now, it shows me that you value this type of content, and it really helps the channel to continue growing. Every like, every comment, every subscription makes a real difference. It's what allows this work to move forward, reaching more people, more stories, more attentive eyes like yours. Subscribe to the channel too. That way you won't miss the next chapters of this journey. And trust me, what's coming will deepen even more everything you've just started to feel, because the human mind still holds many secrets. And then we will start to unravel them. The phrase, "My demons won," was not just a confession. It was a signature, a final act in the face of one's own ruin. And when we observe this type of confession, especially at the end of the line, inevitable questions arise, but also clues. Studying the last words of a serial killer is much more than looking for impact or sensationalism. It is going behind the scenes of a mind that until the last second, maybe trying to maintain control of the narrative. In the world of criminology, these last statements function almost as a final window to access something that has spent much of a person's life hidden or disguised. And this is where psychology comes in strong. It's not just about what was said, but how it was said, when, with what intention. There is weight in each word. There are nuances that, when well interpreted, reveal hidden truths about the emotional, cognitive, and moral structure of these individuals. It is interesting to note that, even on the brink of death, some people still try to manipulate the world's perception of them. Instead of expressing guilt, they opt for ambiguous, mystical, or even poetic messages, as if they were acting out the outcome of a story that they controlled until the last chapter. According to experts, this type of attitude is a striking trait of narcissistic, egocentric personalities, often linked to antisocial personality disorder. The intention is not to redeem themselves, but to immortalize an image, even if distorted. Others, however, choose silence, or dry, harsh sentences, without any hint of emotion. This type of behavior can point to a colder psychopathy, in which the total lack of empathy remains intact until the end. No attempt to justify oneself, no request for forgiveness. Just the chasm, as if it were just another step, like turning a light on or off. There are also those who show a kind of remorse, sometimes genuine, sometimes strategic. I'm sorry for what I did. I hope God forgives me. I pray for the victims every day. Phrases like these sound like attempts at redemption, but they can have very different origins. In some cases, they are genuine expressions of belated guilt, linked to a process of emotional and mental deterioration that occurs after years of isolation, judgment, and reflection. In others, they are desperate maneuvers to soften public perception or secure some kind of final consolation, and that is why analyzing these confessions becomes so valuable. They function as a raw psychological portrait without masks, or at least with the masks cracked. They reveal the type of mentality that operated behind each choice. If there was denial, if there was idealization of one's own crimes, if there was any form of real suffering. All of this can be observed in the intonation, in the language used, in the time it took them to say what they said, or in the choice to say absolutely nothing. From an investigative standpoint, these final lines also help us understand the progression of criminal behavior. There is real value in comparing the last words with psychiatric reports, witness accounts, diaries, letters, and interviews. Last words alone do not conclude a story. They are like missing pieces, sometimes distorted, yes, but still useful, to complete a complex puzzle that science has been trying to put together for decades. And there's something even more disturbing. Many killers show more interest in how they will be remembered than in who they hurt. They speak of themselves in the past tense as characters in a dark novel, almost as if observing their own journey from the outside. This may indicate the emotional detachment typical of serious disorders, but it also raises a profound question. To what extent do they believe their own version of events? Have they at some point confused reality with the fantasy they've constructed in their minds? It is as if, in the face of death, there was still room for a final performance. And it is in this detail, in this boundary between truth and theater, that the most revealing clues about who these people really were are hidden. Behavioral science, in analyzing these latest statements, looks for more than regret. It looks for patterns, connections, elements that can help predict, identify, or even prevent similar behavior in others with compatible traits. It's not about romanticizing criminals. It's about understanding what led them to that point so that no one else has to go down that path again. You may have noticed that when someone reaches this point of declaring something as heavy as "my demons have won," they are not just talking about the present. They are revealing the result of an internal battle that has been fought for years, a fight between what was left of humanity and a growing darkness, fueled by decisions, traumas, distortions, and a lack of empathy. And even if this fight happened, in silence its end leaves traces. Traces that can and should be studied. And now, with all this in mind, tell me, what do you think those words really meant? Were they filled with pain or manipulation? Comment here. Does that say more about him or us? Have you ever stopped to think about what goes on in the mind of someone who has committed such horrible acts that society prefers not to look directly at them? What if, before leaving, that person left a final message? A sentence that in a few words summed up their entire dark journey. Something like, "My demons have won." This sentence is not just a confession. It is a reflection of a lost internal battle, a final surrender to the darkest depths of the human soul. This seemingly simple statement carries with it immense psychological complexity. It reveals much more than a criminal's final act. It offers insight into the mental processes, internal justifications, and distortions of reality that can lead someone to commit atrocities. And that is precisely why these last words are so studied by psychologists, criminologists, and professionals in the field. When someone says, "My demons won," they are, in a way, admitting that there has always been an internal struggle. This struggle could be against past traumas, untreated mental illnesses, or even a distorted view of oneself and the world. By admitting that their demons won, this person is acknowledging that they were unable to resist the forces that dominated them. It is an acceptance of defeat, but also a way of justifying their actions, as if they had no control over them. But is this statement genuine? Or is it just another manipulation, an attempt to gain sympathy or understanding where there is none? This is where the complexity of human behavior comes in. Often, what appears to be a sincere confession can be just another layer of deception, a way to control the narrative until the last moment. And that's exactly what makes these last words so intriguing. They force us to confront our own perceptions of evil, guilt, and responsibility. They challenge us to question how well we can understand the mind of someone who has committed unspeakable acts. Can we really understand what goes on inside the mind of a serial killer? Or are we just projecting our own beliefs and fears onto them? This doubt, this discomfort, is what makes the study of these last words so essential. They are not just words spoken by someone about to die. They are a reflection of a journey, of a transformation, of a mind that got lost somewhere along the way. And understanding these words, deciphering what they really mean, is a way of trying to understand what led that person to become who they became. Now think for a moment. If you were in that person's shoes, if you were about to face the end, what would you say? Would your words be a confession, an excuse, or a plea for forgiveness? Or would they simply be a reflection of a mind that has finally surrendered to its own demons? This reflection is important because it helps us understand not only others, but also ourselves. And that's why we'll continue this journey. Because understanding a serial killer's last words isn't just about understanding the end of a life. It's about understanding the process, the choices, the influences that shaped that person. And in doing so, we can learn more about human nature, about the limits of the mind, and about what it truly means to be human. Comment below, that makes sense to me. Let's continue this conversation, explore together the mysteries of the human mind, and try to understand what really goes on behind those last words. The last night of a convict on death row is a scene that mixes tension, silence, and an expectation that seems suspended in the air. It is a moment in which time seems to slow down, where each second carries the weight of a life about to come to an end. Inside the cell, the environment is cold and impersonal, with grey walls that reflect the dim light of a lamp hanging from the ceiling. The sound of the guard's footsteps echoes through the empty corridors, interrupting the silence that prevails. The condemned man, now alone with his thoughts, faces the reality of his impending fate. Some may spend the remaining hours in reflection, others in denial, and still others seek solace in their beliefs or memories of the past. Anxiety is palpable, and fear of the unknown is mixed with regret, if any. It is an internal struggle that takes place in silence without witnesses, but with eternal consequences. During this last night, the condemned person may receive final visits. Family members, lawyers, or even religious representatives have the opportunity to say goodbye. These visits are often filled with emotion, with words of forgiveness, anger, or even indifference. Each encounter is unique, reflecting the complex human relationships and the different ways of dealing with death. Some convicts make special requests before their execution. They may request a last meal, choose songs to be played, or even ask to write a letter. These requests, as simple as they may seem, are gestures that seek to restore a little control in a situation where it is practically non-existent. They are moments of humanity amidst the dehumanizing process of execution. The psychological climate that night is dense. Fear of what is to come mixes with reflection on what has been done. There is a search for meaning, for understanding, for an explanation, for the events that led up to this. It is a night of confrontation with one's own soul, where the answers can be elusive or painfully clear. Now, as we reflect on these final moments, it is impossible not to ask, what goes on in the mind of someone who reaches this point? Is there genuine remorse, or is it simply an attempt at manipulation? Or perhaps it is a mixture of both, a complex tapestry of emotions and justifications. These questions lead us to explore more deeply the psychology of the condemned, to understand the factors that influence their actions and the consequences of their choices. Comment below. What do you think goes on in the mind of a condemned man on his last night? Let's continue this conversation and try to better understand the mysteries of the human mind. In a cold, silent room with pale walls that tell no stories, a man awaits the end. The sound of metal dragging, the dry sound of the guard's rhythmic footsteps, the rustling of the paper from his last meal. Everything seems clearer, intensified. The human mind, faced with the certainty of death, accesses places that perhaps would never have been visited in life. It is in this environment, suspended between the past and the inevitable, that some of the most revealing statements are heard. And among them, one stands out for its almost symbolic force. "My demons have won." Spoken by a man who marked his life with violence and horror, this sentence does not simply resonate as an attempt at closure. It carries the weight of an internal cycle, of a battle that perhaps began long before the crimes, long before the arrest, long before any punishment. When someone admits that they were defeated by something inside them, they are pointing to a conflict that, at some level, escaped any control. Or so they want us to believe. The criminal mind is often less about pure evil and more about disorganized structures, disconnected emotions, unintegrated traumas, and a constant sense of emptiness that turns into destructive impulses. The final confession in these cases can be a twisted form of redemption, or just another carefully staged act. The problem is that we can't always clearly distinguish where real repentance ends and psychological games begin. By saying that his demons had won, the condemned man may have been trying in part to share his guilt with an external, invisible, almost mystical force. Attributing responsibility to the symbolic figure of the demons may be a way of avoiding the stark reality that it was personal choices that led to one's final fate. But it may also be the only language that such a fragmented mind can find to express regret. The impact of this statement lies in the way it forces us to confront the layers of human nature. Is there a hidden truth here, an admission of failure, or just a dramatic phrase uttered at the last breath intended to leave a mark? Criminal psychology shows us that there are multiple layers to consider. Regret, yes, but also manipulation, narcissism, the need for control, sometimes all of these at once. Inside the cell on the eve of the execution, there is no audience, only a man before his conscience, if it ever manifests itself. It is in this space of silence that masks can follow. But it is also at this exact point that other masks can be erected. And when the door opens and the sentence begins to be carried out, all that remains are those last words. Loaded, symbolic, disturbing. The final confession does not redeem, but it reveals. It may not erase the acts committed nor alleviate the suffering caused, but it can shed a harsh light on the workings of a mind that has gradually become disconnected from any sense of empathy or humanity. In some cases, these words are almost cold, calculated. In others, there is a sincere fragility that emerges. It is as if, at the moment of the end, part of the persona built up over the years dissolves, revealing something rawer, more naked. And this, for those who study the psyche, is deeply significant. There are patterns in these latest speeches, not just in the words themselves, but in the absence of them. There are those who say everything they always wanted to say, in search of some form of impact, and there are those who prefer absolute silence, as if, after all, there was nothing more to be said. Interestingly, both extremes say a lot. They reveal mental structures, levels of empathy, or the complete lack thereof. They reveal internal decisions about how to face the end, with direct confrontation, with emotional escape, or with absolute contempt for one's own life and for the lives that were taken. And even though these words never change the past, they continue to awaken something in those who hear them. They force us to look at what we avoid, facing not only what these people were, but what we all could be in certain circumstances, in journeys of unresolved pain or unresolved decisions. In the face of death, the truth can finally come out, or not. And it is this or not that worries, that challenges, that makes us want to understand even more. There is not always regret. There are not always logical explanations. Sometimes, all that remains is the vestige of a mind destroyed by the labyrinth itself. Now tell me, for you, was that sentence a confession or manipulation? Comment here. I'm still trying to understand. What you can see when analyzing the last words of serial killers is that there is a fascinating variation between genuine regret, calculated manipulation, and, in some cases, even a strange attempt to transcend one's own evil. Each final statement carries within itself a microcosm of the person, their motivations, fears, and the way they deal with the end. Sometimes, these words reveal an attempt to rescue a bit of lost humanity. Other times, they only show the emptiness and coldness of someone who no longer believes in redemption. And then there are those disturbing moments when the words spoken are almost poetic, as if death were a stage for one last show. Let's look at some of these final confessions and reflect on what they really reveal about the individuals who utter them. First, we have the story of Ted Bundy, one of the most infamous serial killers in the United States. Bundy, who confessed to more than 30 murders, became famous for his charming appearance and calculating behavior. His final moments in prison, just days before his execution in 1989, are revealing. In an attempt to find some kind of redemption, or perhaps to manipulate public opinion, he made a final statement that still resonates with many. "I would like to apologize to the families of my victims. I don't know what happened. I know it's too late to apologize, but I hope that someday people will be able to understand what happened to me." While it may seem like a repentance, many experts believe that this statement was more of a form of control, an attempt to shape the narrative of his own life, even at the moment of his death. What is clear is that the lack of true repentance, or the inability to apologize genuinely, was a hallmark of Bundy's behavior until the end. In contrast, there is Aileen Wuornos, a woman whose crimes challenged traditional narratives about serial killers. Wuornos was a prostitute who killed 7 men between 1989 and 1990, claiming that the victims had tried to rape her. At her trial, she claimed that she had acted in self-defense. Before her execution in 2002, Wuornos made a statement that was laced with regret and frustration, conveying the confusion of a broken woman. "I don't want to die. I didn't do anything wrong. I was driven to do what I did, but you killed me for no reason at all. I am being wrongly accused," she said. Her final statement reflects an internal struggle, a woman who may never have been able to separate the victim from the monster, or perhaps has never found a clear path to reconciliation with her actions. Her regret does not seem genuine, but her frustration in its complexity is palpable. It is as if death were the only possible escape for someone who no longer recognized herself. In the case of Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker, the coldness of his words before his execution in 2013 is chilling. Ramirez, responsible for a series of murders and assaults, was known for his uncontrolled and almost satanic behavior. In one of his last statements, he said, "I am the devil and I am going to hell." These words do not indicate any remorse or regret, but rather a disturbing assertion of identity. Rather than surrendering to death with some sign of vulnerability, he clings to the very myth he has constructed throughout his criminal life, reaffirming his role as a monstrous figure. For him, Death did not mean an end, but rather a continuation of his own distorted narrative. The lack of empathy and the lack of any attempt at atonement make his words in some ways all the more repulsive. On the other hand, we have the case of Gary Gilmore, a criminal whose last sentence has gone down in history for its simplicity and almost resignation. In 1977, Gilmore, convicted of murder, became an emblematic figure when he was the first American to be executed after the reinstatement of the death penalty in the United States. His famous "let me go before being shot" became synonymous with an almost indifferent acceptance of death. Unlike many criminals who try to justify or manipulate the circumstances of their end, Gilmore showed no remorse or offered any dramatic explanation. He simply accepted his fate, as if he were at peace with it, although without any attempt to explain or justify his actions. His sentence is one of the most unique in this type of context, as it reflects a total emotional disconnection with the impact of his crimes. These last words are more than just the expressions of someone about to face death. They are a criminal's last opportunities to take a stand, to express himself or to try to leave a mark on the world. While on the one hand, some speeches attempt to touch the audience with regret or a request for forgiveness, on the other hand, many of them reveal a lack of humanity, empathy, or even an attempt to reinforce the narrative of power and control over one's own life until the very last moment. And of course, there are those who, like Gilmore, accept the end outright as a final step towards what they consider inevitable. What is clear is that these words, these final confessions, show us much more than the behavior of a convicted criminal. They reveal to us the mental processes that lead someone to act in such an extreme way, the suffering, denial, or lack of remorse that permeate what we often call the serial killer mentality. Now, what do you think of these confessions? Do the criminals really have any kind of insight into their actions at the final moment? Or is it all just a form of manipulation, a last attempt to avoid responsibility? Comment below. I'm still trying to figure it out. As we delve deeper into the final words of criminals like Ted Bundy, Aileen Wuornos, and Richard Ramirez, an inevitable question arises. What do these statements really reveal about the minds of these individuals? Each statement, no matter how simple or poetic, carries with it layers of complex psychology that speak not only to the circumstances of the crime, but to the mental processes that made these atrocities possible. What goes on in the mind of someone who, after committing cold-blooded, violent murders, can articulate words of regret, manipulation, or even outright contempt? These last words can often be analyzed through different lenses of criminal psychology. One of the concepts that immediately stands out is that of psychopathy, which refers to a pattern of behavior characterized by a lack of empathy, remorse, and a tendency to manipulate others for one's own benefit. Serial killers like Bundy and Ramirez, known for their calculating and callous behavior, clearly illustrate these traits. Even when faced with imminent death, they do not display genuine feelings of remorse. Instead, they seek to control the narrative and often continue to manipulate until the final moments of their lives. Ted Bundy, for example, used his last words not to redeem himself, but to try to justify his actions and find a way to portray himself as a victim of circumstance rather than acknowledging the true gravity of his crimes. Another important psychological concept here is cognitive dissonance, which is the mental tension that occurs when someone experiences internal conflicts between their beliefs and their actions. In the context of a serial killer, this can be evidenced by the way the perpetrator justifies his or her actions to himself or herself, trying to reconcile the image of himself or herself with his or her monstrous actions. Aileen Wuornos, in her final words, seemed to still be trapped in a cycle of denial. Although she expressed some regret, her words also reflected an inability to accept full responsibility for the crimes she had committed. She saw herself as a victim, a woman who acted in self-defense, and this is a classic example of cognitive dissonance, where the perception of herself as a victim overrode the reality of her actions. On the other hand, Richard Ramirez's phrase, "I am the devil and I am going to hell," represents a clear example of narcissism. The idea of identifying oneself as a demonic figure, instead of admitting guilt or even reflecting on the impact of one's actions, is an extreme expression of egocentrism. This attitude does not reflect genuine repentance, but rather a reaffirmation of one's disturbed identity. The need for power, control, and in some cases even to become a mythical figure in one's own delusion is characteristic of destructive narcissism, where the person sees themselves as a unique entity, above moral laws and even death. Even more interesting is the issue of genuine remorse, which is something that is rarer among criminals of this nature. Most serial killers rarely express genuine remorse, not only because of their psychopathic nature, but also because of a lack of empathy, something that is essential to truly understanding the consequences of their actions. When they talk about their victims, they often do so in a cold and distant manner, as if the people they killed were objects and not human beings. With families and stories, this emotional disconnect, the disconnect between the acts committed and the lack of emotion when talking about them, is indicative of a deeply dysfunctional mind. However, this does not mean that all criminals are psychopaths or narcissists. Some of these statements may be attempts to make amends for something that was never fully acknowledged or experienced. The journey of someone who has committed terrible acts may involve an internal struggle to find some kind of explanation or excuse for what they did, as an attempt to reconcile their view of themselves with the horror of their actions. In Gilmore's case, with his simple "let me go," the lack of emotion may in part suggest a peaceful surrender to the inevitability of his fate, an acceptance of punishment without attempts to manipulate or cover up his wrongdoing. These statements, full of guilt, narcissism, denial, or even an attempt to portray themselves as mythological figures, are more than just words of farewell. They reveal the psychological state of individuals who have often lived a life full of emotional and cognitive distortions. What these last words show is that behind every crime, no matter how horrible, there is a complex set of motivations and psychologies that guided these people's choices. Whether it is an attempt at manipulation, ego defense, or a simple lack of empathy, what they teach us about the criminal mind is a lesson in how reality can be distorted until it becomes unrecognizable. This analysis leads us to reflect on the impact of society, childhood, and the experiences that shape these individuals. What did it take for these people to reach the point of committing such crimes? What aspects of the human psyche make us capable of somehow rationalizing such acts? These questions help us understand not only the criminals, but also the complexity of human nature and the boundaries between goodness and monstrosity. And what do you think? Could some of these statements really have some basis in regret or remorse? Or could it all just be a way to manipulate the situation until the last moment? Comment below, is there really regret in cases like this? When we think about the last words of such disturbing figures as the serial killers we have discussed, a question begins to form in our minds. Is it possible that these individuals felt genuine guilt? Amidst all the pain they caused, could some kind of true repentance, however distant or fragmented, have emerged? Or could it all be nothing more than a last attempt at manipulation, a final staging to control the narrative until the final moments? These questions are complex, and each case brings to light profound aspects of human nature, especially how we deal with guilt, regret, and responsibility for our actions. For many of us, the idea of redemption is linked to the process of inner change, of recognizing the wrong that one has done and trying in some way to make amends or at least express sincere repentance. But when we are talking about psychopaths or individuals who have committed such monstrous acts, this concept of redemption seems, at first glance, something distant, perhaps even impossible. What would it take for a human being who caused so much suffering to come to the conclusion that his actions were truly wrong? And what's more, did any of these criminals really come to this conclusion, or were the words of repentance they expressed, in fact, a last-ditch strategy to manipulate public opinion, or even to try to alleviate the pain they felt inside? It is difficult for us as observers to have a clear and objective view of what goes on in the mind of someone who commits such appalling crimes. Perhaps what strikes us most is the behavior of these individuals in the face of imminent death, an opportunity that may be their last chance to express some kind of genuine sense of guilt. When we consider the last words of someone like Ted Bundy, who even when facing execution tried to recant in a way that seemed more like an attempt at control than a genuine acknowledgement of his mistakes. The idea of redemption seems even more vague. Bundy, for example, claimed that his crimes were the result of his compulsion and spoke in an almost scientific manner about his psychology, suggesting a disconnect between his actions and genuine empathy for his victims. On the other hand, cases like that of Aileen Wuornos, who expressed regret for her actions, seem to raise an even deeper question. Can repentance arise in someone who has lived a life so marked by pain, abuse, and psychological distress? Wuornos, who has suffered many hardships in her life, including sexual abuse, seemed at times to almost beg for forgiveness, but at the same time, her words also indicated that she never stopped seeing herself as someone defending herself, someone who was forced to act in that way. This leads us to wonder, was her confession genuine or yet another attempt to justify her actions? The line between sincere repentance and justification seems in this case especially thin. Now, the question of redemption can be further complicated when we consider the role of cognitive dissonance in criminals. Many of us may feel torn between our behaviors and the beliefs we hold. However, for someone who has committed multiple homicides, this division becomes a defense mechanism that prevents them from directly confronting the pain and guilt of their actions. Genuine repentance, which requires painful and direct confrontation of the wrong one has done, often conflicts with this psychic defense. So the idea of redemption, for these individuals, may not be a path to healing, but rather an attempt to adjust their internal perceptions to bear the weight of their actions without breaking down psychologically. At the same time, it raises enormous doubts about the sincerity of any request for forgiveness or final reflection. If we think about it from a deeper perspective, would any of us be able to completely redeem ourselves for such cruel actions? Even after deep repentance, how would it be possible to undo the damage done to so many lives? The word redemption becomes increasingly loaded with immense psychological weight when we deal with people who have already surpassed all boundaries of human empathy. Perhaps the real question is whether redemption in this case would even be something accessible, or whether the process of confronting oneself and the pain one has caused others is a path that these individuals are not capable of following to the end. On the other hand, what makes us human is our capacity for empathy, for learning from our mistakes and, if possible, for making peace with what has been done. But is this kind of transformation, this kind of inner journey, possible for those who operate so far outside the bounds of human normality? Can we really expect someone like Richard Ramirez, who seemed to see death as a continuation of his demonic path, to find some kind of redemption? On some level, this discussion of redemption and repentance resonates with us because it forces us to look at ourselves and question to what extent our own failures can be overcome. To what extent can our choices, our actions, be forgiven or transformed? What differentiates those who seek true change from those who, like many of these criminals, are still more concerned with manipulating reality for their own psychological survival? Now, I invite you to reflect. What do you think about this? Is there a fine line between repentance and final staging in these cases? Is it possible that some of these criminals have truly reached a level of awareness about the harm they have caused? Or are we just seeing a last-ditch attempt to control the narrative of their stories? Comment below. Repentance or manipulation? When we think about the last words of serial killers, we inevitably reflect on the impact that these confessions, or lack thereof, have on the victims, their families, and society as a whole. For many, these final statements can bring relief, a necessary closure to understand what motivated such atrocities. For others, however, these words can reopen old wounds, bringing to the surface all the suffering of a process that seemed to have already been overcome, or at least stored in a box of painful memories. What is often overlooked is that behind the figure of the criminal are the stories of those who have lost loved ones. The impact of a final confession goes beyond what we can imagine. For the families of victims, the revelation of a motive, however, cold and calculating it may be, can be a double-edged sword. On the one hand, it can bring a sense of justice, a small compensation for the immeasurable pain they have suffered, knowing, even in tortuous words, that the criminal acknowledges his actions can be seen as an attempt to make amends, even if symbolically, for the harm caused. But at the same time, the confession can also be a cruel reminder that their lives will never be the same again. What happened can never be erased, and the pain often remains eternally deep in the soul. These final words can then revive the suffering that was slowly being overcome, making it difficult for the victims, even if indirectly, to move on with their lives. But does the public also feel relieved when they hear these confessions? In a way, we often find ourselves in a position where we seek some rational explanation, a reason for everything that happened. The human mind has an almost instinctive tendency to seek meaning in the most chaotic things, as if, somehow, this understanding could bring some kind of relief. When a criminal is willing to tell the details of his actions, even if in a cold or macabre way, some see it as a step towards the truth, a type of justice that is not only punitive, but also restorative. Society feels that, in some way, the cycle is closed, the evil is acknowledged, and a fragile peace is restored. However, this idealistic view often clashes with the reality that not every confession brings this sense of relief. The psychological impact of these final words, both for the victims and for society, is complex. For families, these words can be a reflection of how real the suffering was, how much the pain of loss will never be overcome. And even when a criminal tries to redeem himself or apologize, the weight of the death and the atrocities he committed cannot be softened. For society on a larger scale, the final confessions of serial killers are often absorbed in an almost voyeuristic way, as a spectacle of human perversion. This does not diminish the gravity of what was said, but it creates a morbid curiosity about the behavior of these people, which seems to never subside. The line between justice and the desire for revenge becomes blurred at this point. Justice often wants to be restored in a concrete way, with severe punishments, but the reality that a simple word cannot heal the open wounds becomes all too clear. And even if the perpetrator tries to express remorse, or even if he confesses his actions in a shocking and direct way, what really changes? For the families, the damage is done, and the wounds remain. Justice may be served in court, but what about the emotional pain, the sense of irreparable loss, the feeling that nothing will be able to restore what was taken? Nothing, not even the most sincere confession, can fill the void left by these tragedies. At the same time, some argue that these last words, disturbing as they are, may offer an opportunity for society to reflect on the nature of crime, punishment, and responsibility. By giving criminals a voice, by hearing them confess, we are also exposed to human cruelty in its rawest and most visceral form. And this, as painful as it is, forces us to face the reality of what some human beings are capable of doing. This exposure to the truth, however difficult it may be to bear, can be a way of purging society of repressed fear, of a desire for understanding that manifests itself in the search for answers, even in the most extreme situations. Now, when we talk about the ability of these confessions to heal or reopen wounds, it is worth reflecting. Are we in some way waiting for a repentance that will never come? Could it be that by waiting for these criminals to express pain, we ourselves are seeking something that, in many cases, will never be delivered? The truth, however painful it may be, can be much more than just the simple revelation of a criminal act. It is also a revelation about who we are as a society, about how we deal with justice and with the pain of those who have lost so much. Each of those final words, each confession made in those final hours, carries the weight of a reality that transcends the simple act of punishment. They are in fact part of a larger story, a story that involves not only the perpetrator, but also those left behind, trying to understand day by day what happened and what can be done with the pain that remains. In the end, the impact of those words goes far beyond the simple desire for justice. They become a window into human complexity, a question of how we deal with our own fears, regrets, and perhaps even our own shadows. Comment: does the truth really relieve pain? As these criminals' journeys draw to a close, we are confronted not only with the weight of their final words, but with a mirror that reflects something deeper about ourselves. When someone is put in a position to face the inevitable, something, in their words, can often carry a hidden truth, a revelation about human nature, about regret or the lack thereof. They are confronted with what they have done, and in those final moments we all wonder, what are they really thinking? What goes through the mind of someone who knows there is no more time, that there is no more hiding from their own shadow? Now, as you look at those last words, have you ever stopped to think about what you would say if you were in that same position? What does a person feel when they know they are about to take their last breath, their last word, and that those words could resonate in the memories of many for generations? How might they be shaped? What would you say to the world if you had 1 minute to summarize your entire life, your choices and your regrets? This is a question that confronts us with something deeper than the stories of the criminals themselves, because in the end, it's not just about them. The question is about how we deal with the idea of death, regret, and the words we choose to leave to the world. These last words are in some ways a reflection of who we are, the decisions we make, and the impact we make, both positive and negative. And when we see these confessions, whether of genuine guilt or of a psychological game, it is as if the human mind is laying itself bare before us. They challenge us to think, if it were me, what would I say? Now, back in our own reality, where the consequences of our actions may not be as drastic but are still significant, these reflections make us question our own choices. Every word we speak, every decision we make, carries a weight. It may seem small, but in the end, it is what truly defines who we are. So if you had 1 last minute to live, what would you say? What would your last sentence carry? Would it be a plea for forgiveness, a declaration of truth, or perhaps a sincere repentance? This question makes us reflect on our journey, on the impact of our actions, and on how we choose to live until the last second. Because in reality, what we say at the end of our lives, or even throughout them, reveals much more about us than we imagine. Comment there. If it were my last minute, I would say, so if you've made it this far, it's because this reflection made some sense to you. We've traveled a complex path full of emotions and questions, and if you're feeling touched, it's because something we talked about resonated with your own journey. I really appreciate your company until the end of this video. If you feel that this type of content brings something of value that makes you think and rethink, subscribe to the channel. I love bringing up topics like this that make us reflect on life decisions and the impact we have on the world around us. And of course, if the video made sense to you, leave a like. It really helps us to continue with this work, bringing more deep reflections, like this one. Now, there is a video here that will continue this reasoning, delving a little deeper into this topic, and I'm sure will encourage you to think even more. Click there, and let's continue this conversation. And finally, if you've come this far and are on this journey of reflection with me, comment below with a phrase like, "This conversation stayed with me," or something that shows that this reflection touched something in you. Let's go on this journey together. See you soon.